Good morning and welcome to Sharper Iron. Spend the next hour with us studying the living and active Word of God, His two-edged sword of law and gospel, recorded for you in Holy Scripture, all about Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and ascended for you. Thanks for tuning in this morning here on Worldwide KFUO, Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. I'm your host, Pastor Timothy Appel of Grace Lutheran Church in Smithville, Texas. Sharper Iron is underwritten by the Lutheran Church Extension Fund, where your investments help support the work of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Visit lcef.org for more information. On this Friday, September 3rd, we are studying Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 16 to 19. The prophet concludes his psalm and his book with a joyful confession of faith in the Lord's power to save his people. To help us sharpen our faith in Christ as we study God's Word today, we have with us returning guest, the Reverend Dr. Ryan Tietz. Dr. Tietz serves as Associate Professor of Exegetical Theology and Dean of Students at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Dr. Tietz, welcome back to Sharper Iron.
Oh, man, it's fun, and thanks for bringing me back to Habakkuk. This is just one of those absolutely marvelous books of the Old Testament that most of us kind of ignore.
Well, there's that one verse in chapter 2 that we know well because Paul quotes it in Romans chapter 1. And actually, there's a couple of quotations from Habakkuk 1 as well. Habakkuk 1:5 we discovered was also quoted in the book of Acts. So it's not absent from New Testament theology, but it is a short book. He's one of the minor prophets. It can be easy to skip over him when you're flipping through the pages of the Old Testament, and he doesn't show up a ton in the lectionary, but he's there at least once. So with the prophet Habakkuk, we've got the very last part of the book today, just the last 4 verses. What's Habakkuk been doing? What are the themes that he talks about, the conversation he has with the Lord? What do we need to know that we're going to see him kind of bring together here in this last text?
Yeah, because starting really at verse 16, this is that great moment where Habakkuk kind of takes a deep breath, and we'll see the language in 16. He definitely has his moment of, here's what's been going on. But what I love about this book, and why it's a book that I continue to just look forward to teaching, is that it is that back and forth of Habakkuk being able to have that really honest conversation with God. And when you started to look at that language, especially way back forever ago now in Habakkuk 1, is that Habakkuk doesn't pull any punches in this. And that's what I love about how he complains. And he never is accused of sinning, even though at times, thinking back to parts of Habakkuk 1, he really goes after God and says, "Look, God, you're unfair. You're a God who doesn't hear, which means you're no better than an idol for that matter." And just that strong language, God's response, and in that dialogue, Habakkuk is able to really be that person who lives by faith and what it even looks like.
So, and I think that verse, that live by faith verse in Habakkuk 2:4 really is what we're seeing here in Habakkuk 3, that the prophet, even with all that strong language, that through that back and forth with God, through that very act of what you might say is, lamenting or complaining even, that Habakkuk has been brought by the Lord through the word of the Lord to the point where he's able to speak the words of this psalm, which certainly have a much more, confident tone than maybe the questioning that was in chapter 1. Habakkuk's really he's been brought quite a ways, it seems, from where he was in chapter 1 to where we're hearing him pray now in chapter 3.
Yeah, you probably should get a personal injury lawyer to sponsor this program, because the amount of whiplash that Habakkuk puts you through is actually kind of nuts. Because, it's back and forth, and the man of faith is the one who does voices concerns to God boldly, and that's Habakkuk 1. But through all of this, he gets brought back to this attitude of faith that is able to accept what's going to come, even though it's still pretty darn awful.
As I was reflecting on the book of Habakkuk as a whole, we're here at Grace, we're studying the book of Psalms right now in Sunday morning Bible class, and we did Psalm 13 not that long ago. And Psalm 13 starts very similarly to the book of Habakkuk. And actually, as we're reflecting on it, Psalm 13 is almost like a miniature version of Habakkuk. It seems like Habakkuk kind of expands on on Psalm 13, at least at the beginning and the end. In Psalm 13, you have the opening, the protest that's there where David asks, "How long, O Lord?" much like Habakkuk does. But by the end of Psalm 13, which is only 6 verses long, David's saying, I've trusted in your steadfast love. I rejoice. I'll sing to the Lord. And it's like Habakkuk is that same movement, but he expands it more. You get to see a little bit more of the back and the forth that's there, that's maybe not there in Psalm 13. I told the Bible class that I love Psalm 13 because it is just so compact, and you don't always get to see the full process, and that's kind of nice on the one hand, just to know how the Lord works. Here in Habakkuk, you get to see more of the picture, and I think that's just as helpful, to encourage that kind of prayer and then trust in the Lord. So, I don't know, those two things in my mind as I was preparing for our conversation, really, I was putting those two things together, and I saw them having a similar trajectory.
Yeah, and that's where in Psalm 13 is just an absolute gem. And one of the problems that you run into in a Psalm 13, or even pick a bigger lament, like say we'll go with the oldie and the goodie Psalm 22, is that the challenge is always, how do you get from that severe accusations against God, questioning God, however you want to phrase that, and then suddenly the psalmist is in a good mood, or at least he's able to seem. It almost has this Pollyanna moment, and I still remember a congregation member at a church I served at back in Chicago, more than a few lifetimes ago. I was teaching, I forget, one of these psalms, and she comes up to me and, "Pastor Tietz, I hate laments." And the moment you hear language like hate from a congregation member, you have that pause moment. And I'm like, okay. And I had my pastoral panic moment of what's going on here. And the reason, and I'm like, so say more about it. She's like, "I hate how they go from being so upset to having their Pollyanna moment, because it just doesn't seem real." And what's great about our journey of faith is that we don't know how we get from these cries of despair to confident faith, or to at least faith that's at peace with what's going on. And you're right, Habakkuk at least gives us a little bit more of a sense of the journey, as opposed to Psalm 13, which is subtly, he turned his frown upside down and you don't quite know how he got there.
Yeah.
But that's part of the journey of these, where we as hearers, as we pray these, our own journey won't be the same as David in Psalm 13, but we are able to move from lament to at least peace, joy, yes, happiness, maybe not.
Now, Habakkuk, this is the third chapter of Habakkuk, is a prayer. We called it a psalm in yesterday's show in the first 15 verses. Would you classify, we've been talking about the book as a whole, I suppose, but the psalm that we're talking about in chapter 3, would you classify it as a lament, or is there, how does it compare to, say, some of the psalms that we've got in the book of Psalms?
Okay, first of all, my thanks to whoever covered these first 15 verses of Habakkuk 3. When I hear Habakkuk 3, and I teach this book actually on a pretty regular basis here at the seminary, the moment I hear Habakkuk 3, I actually go into a slight panic attack. The first part, these first 15 verses that I'm so glad somebody else covered, for purely selfish standpoint, they're some of the hardest Hebrew in the entire Bible. Degree of difficulty is off the charts, and I deal with Isaiah for a living. It's really tough Hebrew. But it really is, it's a psalm, I would call it a psalm of hope, a psalm of praise, and also a psalm of perspective. Namely, here's the God who is mighty to save, and you cannot stop his salvation. Even as he, tramples upon the rivers, and you have that just rich language throughout these first 15 verses.
Yeah, it was Dr. Reed Lessing who covered the first 15 verses, and he mentioned the same thing to me about the about the Hebrew of Habakkuk 3 being very difficult. He had that same memory as well. So,
okay, good. I'm in good company, because honestly, when I see the last time I taught Habakkuk, which is actually this past winter, I make students do presentations. And I was so thankful that a student, against my better advice, volunteered to teach Habakkuk 3. I was more than happy to let him struggle, because the language there is extremely difficult.
So we're dealing with Hebrew poetry, and you mentioned to me earlier that you love Hebrew poetry, and we've talked about this several times on Sharper Iron because we deal with poetic sections a lot, particularly in the prophets. But I think it's always a helpful reminder because Hebrew poetry doesn't work with the same ways as English poetry does. So as we read Hebrew poetry, even just these 4 verses, what are some of the things we need to be looking for? What kind of features make Hebrew poetry go?
Yeah. Oh, the good news is we don't have to worry about rhyme or rhythm, which is somebody who can never scan a poem to save his life back in high school makes me feel a deep sigh of relief. Probably the biggest characteristic of it is its terseness. It's short. So you and I were quipping before I came on the show that I'm not used to dealing with Hebrew prose because it has too many words, as opposed to oftentimes 3 or 4 words, extremely terse. And that's part of its power because we as hearers it draws us into the imagery, which I would also say is the other major characteristic of this use of big, bold imagery. There's nothing understated about Hebrew poetry. In fact, one of the classics on Hebrew poetry, they list all these great poetic devices, and then they get to understatement, and it's the shortest entry in the entire book. Namely, Hebrew never figured out understatement. Here's 1/2 of a possible example. But just this over-the-top, vivid imagery. And along those lines, we have the classic parallelism. How do these 2 half lines relate to each other? But its power is in these images and that terseness that really we as hearers are invited to savor and slow down. You can't read Hebrew poetry quickly. Instead, you slow down and savor it.
I talked to Dr. Paul Robbie about the book of Obadiah recently, and he said the same thing about Hebrew poetry, that you really have to slow down, really dig into the images that are there. It's not meant to be read fast, but it is meant to be savored, as you said. So that's what we're going to get to do with these last 4 verses of the book of Habakkuk. In terms of the images that we saw in yesterday's text, in the first 15 verses, what are some of, what was he doing in the first part of this psalm, and how's that going to connect to what we're going to read today?
Okay, the first piece it really is a psalm of perspective, which I think I might have just, here I am on the air inventing new labels for psalms, I guess, where it is so much of a recounting of just the might and power of God. Lots of Exodus language, so thinking back to 3 verse 5 in particular, the pestilence that goes before him, the plague at his heels, and also recounting all of these major times in which God has put a stop to chaos and to evil. So the other image that I just absolutely love is verse 8, the anchor against the rivers. And one of the toughest miracles that I always thought to preach on was Jesus walking on the water. Some of the miracles are impressive. Walking in the water for me always seemed kind of anticlimactic. But when you think of Jesus walking on the water being a proclamation of God as the victor over chaos, we actually see that language there, especially in verse 8.
All right, so let's take a look then at the verses that we've got for today. This is Habakkuk 3, verses 16 to 19. I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choirmaster with stringed instruments. That's the end of the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk 3, verses 16 to 19. Dr. Tietz, let's savor this Hebrew poetry today. You were talking earlier about the really big images. And I think that's how these verses start, where Habakkuk speaks about his body trembling and for example, rottenness entering into his bones. I mean, those are that's really vivid imagery. They're really big images. What is Habakkuk? I mean, why is he feeling this way? What's he talking about here in this physical description of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, you can almost hear Habakkuk here just taking this almost massive, deep breath over everything that he's been through and this entire back and forth, throwing some woes for good measure into, and just the ups and downs of this entire thing. To say nothing of this vivid recounting of God's mighty works in 3:1-15, is that he is taking just this big breath of air and is utterly shaken by everything that he finally realizes. So we go from something really simple to I've heard, okay, fair enough. But then his very being, his beten would be the Hebrew word there, my very being, my very inmost being is quaking. The image of it's almost, quite literally, the language is his stomach is growling, which is, so I guess what Habakkuk, if you want to be really flippant, Habakkuk has indigestion. But perhaps better yet, seeing that he is completely overcome in awe of what it means to have a God who is mighty to save, even though bad stuff is going to happen. So yeah, and really, yeah.
Well, I mean, so okay, that was going to be, what is causing this reaction in him was one of the questions that I was wondering about this. What is it that's making his body tremble? Is it the thought of the Chaldeans coming and wreaking such havoc on the people of Judah, of knowing that he's going to have to go through that? I mean, thinking through some of the, we came out of the book of Jeremiah not long ago, and some of the sufferings that Jeremiah describes that, Habakkuk's told us about how bad the Chaldeans are. Is he upset? Is he thinking about that? And that's why he's trembling? Is he trembling at the thought? And I think that maybe this is more the direction you're taking us, trembling at the thought of knowing that God is the creator of all things, the ruler over all things. He can use the Babylonians as he wills, and just sort of marveling at all this causes this sort of reaction. That maybe sounds like more of the way that you're going, but that is one of the questions that I was wondering with this text. Can you dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, he's having his Job moment. And the book that really reads very beautifully with Habakkuk is the book of Job. Again, much longer. But in terms of, in one sense, there is the awe of who am I that God is still in charge, that God is still there. However, picking up on your earlier your observation, there's not only this sense of awe of realizing that God is God and Habakkuk's not, which is part of what this book is about. But there also is that verb ragaz there for what his bowels are doing. Is that it also has that sense of absolute terror. And here it's not the fear of the Lord, it's not the sense of awe that God is God and you're not, but also this absolute terror of what he knows is going to happen. And that there's no way that he's going to avoid these sufferings that, with the Chaldeans on the scene, are quite literally knocking on his doorstep.
Well, I mean, I do think that the fear of the Lord is related, maybe not in the way that we often use it in most of our speech, like with the catechism, but we talked a little bit about this yesterday in 3 verse 2, because Habakkuk brings up, your work, O Lord, do I fear? And we talked a little bit about that. Well, what does that mean for Habakkuk? And I think certainly, God is God, Habakkuk is not. Recognizing his place before God is always a part of the fear of the Lord. But I do think in the context of Habakkuk knowing what's about to happen and knowing that the Lord is the one bringing all this about because he's God and Habakkuk's not, there is that, fear and trembling. And Habakkuk is, feeling it quite literally in his own body at this moment. Yeah,
and the language for his experience is actually pretty impressive. You start talking about how these images just almost trip over each other. We go from his very inmost being is quaking, the ragaz word, but then his lips, but then that strange phrase that you pointed out as you were even reading it out loud, and I had forgotten about it until I was reviewing this text, is that whole notion of rot entering his bones, which is a very odd image. There's lots of bone imagery in the Bible, don't get me wrong, but what does it mean to have his bones being rotten? And it's this sense of him really having nothing on his own other than God's mercy to depend upon. And thanks for bringing us back to Habakkuk 3 verse 2. And And Habakkuk 3 verse 2 is this great plea of, okay, lots of wrath is coming, but don't forget that you are the God who's gracious and merciful, slow to anger. Don't forget your chesed. Don't forget your mercy.
Yeah, I really keep going.
Oh, and Habakkuk can count on that, and he's still counting on it, and he's hanging on to it even while the Babylonians are coming, and Habakkuk knows exactly who these people are, and they're absolutely terrifying.
Well, and I really do think now that the more that I look at 3 verse 2 and compare that to 3:16, it does seem that really is in view here again, which, I mean, that would be good Hebrew poetry, I suppose, to repeat thoughts that have been brought up earlier and to have them come up again, that on the one hand, Habakkuk knows that this wrath of God expressed through the Chaldeans is coming, and that causes him to tremble. And yet he concludes this verse 16, with that note of hope of waiting quietly for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Which, I mean, that's looking pretty far into the future there for Habakkuk. That waiting that he's talking about, it's not just waiting for, say, the trouble to be gone for the people of Israel, but it's ultimately waiting for that same trouble then to come upon the Chaldeans. I mean, again, there's that Habakkuk 2 verse 4, the righteous living by faith. Habakkuk is, I mean, he's putting that into practice. He's praying, I think, based on that verse, just in what we're seeing in verse 16 here.
Yeah, and he knows that evil at the end of the day, even God's wrath, doesn't have the final word. And that actually as we start wrapping up this book in these final 4 verses, it really goes back to those woes, which are the easiest part of Habakkuk to skip over. We got the dialogue at the beginning. That's fun. We got the righteous will live by his faith. Big deal. But then we go into that series of hoys, the series of woes. And Habakkuk is also, that's part of Habakkuk's faith perspective he has, if you will. Knowing that at the end of the day, all of this evil, whether if it's the evil of his day or the coming trouble of the Chaldeans, none of it will ultimately last. And that's why those woes really do help us understand really why he's able to have this perspective. Knowing that bad stuff is happening, but ultimately it's temporary. And that's where that language of hoy there that appears multiple times in chapter 2 is pretty important.
I think you said it this way, that Habakkuk knows even God's wrath doesn't have the last word. Did I catch that right?
Yeah, this notion that at the end of the day, and I got to be careful how I nuance this, I realize. I got to love thinking out loud on occasion, is that at the end of the day, evil will be punished, and we have to be very beautifully honest about that whenever we're talking about the eschatology of the Old Testament. Take a look at the final verse of Isaiah. It's the verse that the lectionary omits. Why? Because we don't want to think about going to look at the punished ones. Is that the trouble of Habakkuk's day, and that may be a better way to even phrase that, ultimately doesn't have the last word. Is that Habakkuk is the one who knows that God redeems him, God loves him, and God's going to preserve him along with the remnant, even while this remnant is going to be going through some really nasty stuff.
Well, and the way, and I appreciate the way you clarified that, the way that you said it, that about God's wrath not having the last word. Right. It brought to mind, and I think I talked about this yesterday with Dr. Lessing as well, in the book of Lamentations, where Jeremiah talks about that God does not, and I can't remember exactly how it's said, afflict his children from his heart. That when God's wrath does come, and Habakkuk knows that God's wrath upon the Judeans is coming, that he's not doing it as his last word for them. He's not doing it because he wants to hurt them, but he's doing them he's doing that as a father disciplines his children. And again, it sounds like that faith, that's expressed in the book of Lamentations, is at play here for Habakkuk as well.
Yeah, that's where, you talk about Lamentations, again, one of those books that we only know for one verse, great is thy faithfulness, right. Which is a very strange thing in Lamentations, given the fact that most of it is all about all the bad stuff that's happening. And it's a very similar idea here in Habakkuk.
Well, and the book of Lamentations has that one part, as we were talking earlier, it's got that one part in the middle that's just so hopeful, and it's surrounded by lamentations. And again, you're kind of wondering, well, where did that come from? And again, Habakkuk gives us more of the more of the story, I think. That one thing that as I want to talk a little bit about here in verse 16 is the way that Habakkuk does pray here. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. This is, and we've talked a little bit about this in some other prophetic literature as well, but it maybe strikes us as a bit strange. Why not just pray, I will wait quietly for the Lord to save us? Instead, he prays for, he waits quietly for the day of trouble to come upon the invaders. Why does the Old Testament so often pray in that way? And how can we as Christians still make use of that kind of prayer today?
Yeah, he could have said something a little bit nicer of, I want to use your language. Wouldn't have been nice had he said, wait for God to redeem us, and let's not talk about what happens to the oppressor. And that's so much of what hope looks like. And when this gets into even notions of, when you talk about God as a jealous God, which causes all kinds of, speaking of bowels quaking, to use the language of Habakkuk, all kinds of heartburn, is this idea that that we want evil to end. It's not our job to end it. We trust that God is the God who's going to do that. And that's what he's doing. There's no vigilantism here in Habakkuk 3. There never is really vigilantism in the Bible. But instead, it's this notion of, as we experience persecution, as we experience suffering, especially from the hands of others, we want that suffering to end. And that's the prayer, and Habakkuk gives us the words for it. And we see that Habakkuk is, like you said, by no means unique with that.
So for us as Christians to pray that, maybe we say, to pray that evil would end, that doesn't sound strange. And we should be able to pray that, because that is what we want God to do. We want him to be just and righteous, to be who he is, because we know that when he is those things and when he does those things, it will turn out well for us. That's precisely what we want. That's where his salvation is found, is in that justice and righteousness. And we can pick up more of that on the other side of the break. You're listening to Sharper Iron here on KFUO. We're talking the end of Habakkuk 3 with Dr. Ryan Tietz. We'll be right back. Please stick around.
Since 1978, Lutheran Church Extension Fund has had the humble privilege of supporting Lutheran Church Missouri Synod ministries and her workers. Thanks to faithful investors, LCEF has provided thousands of church workers, congregations, schools, and organizations with the low-cost loans and resources they need to reach more people with the saving name of Christ. To learn more, visit lcef.org or call 800-843-5233, 800-843-5233.
Welcome back to Sharper Iron. It is Friday, September 3rd. We are studying Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 16 to 19 with the Reverend Dr. Ryan Tietz. He's the Associate Professor of Exegetical Theology and the Dean of Students at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Dr. Tietz, prior to the break, we were talking about verse 16, that last part where Habakkuk says he's going to wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon the invaders. Talking a little bit about the way that prayer may strike us a bit unusual today, and yet it is a prayer that we need to pray, that God would bring justice, that he would put an end to evil. One of the things that I find helpful, at least in my own thinking about this, is that when I pray in that way, that I should recognize that part of the evil God needs to put an end to is found within me. We talk about the devil, the world, and our sinful nature as our enemies. And so when I ask God, to put an end to evil, I think it helps me not to pray it with pride when I recognize part of that prayer is I'm asking God, deal with the evil that's inside me as well. And I think that's another way, again, that maybe we can start making use of that prayer again as Christians.
Yeah, and that's an important point that you make there, mostly because it's so much more enjoyable to pray that the evil outside ends, as opposed to the recognition that we ourselves are in desperate need of having that old Adam be drowned daily, or depending minute by minute, second by second, and how that's also part of our prayer of, put the evil. The one thing what all Lutherans know is that we're poor, miserable sinners. Yeah. And that constant, there is no room for pride here, to think that we're somehow better. and this idea of that we also need that evil, the old Adam or old Eve, to be put to death constantly.
Yeah, and certainly then to pray with boldness against those enemies of Christ and his church, because we know that those enemies would ally with our own sinful nature to wreak us great havoc. And so, to pray against those, I think that's the way, Luther talks in the third petition. We would pray for thy will be done. That's what we're praying, that God would not let those enemies have their way, and that he would do his will, because we know his will is good and gracious for us. And so, again, to pray that God would do his will and to put an end to evil, this is a prayer we should speak as Christians in faith that God will do so and bring about his good and gracious will. Any more comments there on verse 16, Dr. Tietz?
Yeah, and what's really important about this whole book and what we've just been talking about is that evil is not an abstraction, is that this takes evil and suffering very seriously. And that's what's liberating about Habakkuk, for that matter. There's no rationalizing this away. Really awful stuff is coming that he is begging for God to bring it into, knowing that God's going to bring it into it.
I think it's a really important point, that this is it's not rationalizing evil away, but it's taking it seriously. And then it's taking it to the Lord, because it's when we try to rationalize evil away or deal with it outside of the way Habakkuk deals with it, that's when we run into all kinds of trouble, I think, when we try to, sort of speak about evil theoretically. Habakkuk just handles it, takes it head on, but then he takes it to the Lord and puts it in the Lord's hands to deal with. And I think that's how Habakkuk can end up in the place that he does, is because he's not theorizing about it or trying to be, rationalize it. He's simply letting it be what it is, and then taking that to the Lord and putting it in his hands. And again, I think that's where Habakkuk, as a book as a whole, and the way we see him ending, really stands as a great example for us as Christians today.
Yeah, and that's where and back kind of one of your earlier questions, kind of why Hebrew poetry and what does it do? The other thing that Hebrew poetry, and why so much of the biggest theological stuff in the Old Testament all in poetry, is that this is not a bloodless abstraction here. This speaks to the whole person, and that's so much of the power of all of these images. And we see that here just in verse 16. Everything about him that he thought he could count on. If you talk about the language of my bone, that rot enters my bones. The bones. This is the part that always lasts. This is the strength of the human. Even that cannot stand up. And how there is this really important emotional quality to poetry. The example I use when I teach is, it's one thing to say God is love. True statement. It's quite another thing to say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, etc., and go down Psalm 23. In some ways, they both, in terms of content, are the same way. But man, let me tell you, savoring those images of a shepherd, or in this case, not quite so positive, the images of his absolute astoundedness, however we want to try to capture 3:16 of Habakkuk. But it does speak to us as a whole person, not just some bloodless abstraction. And that's why I just love being able to talk to work in poetry.
Yeah, with a verse like Habakkuk 3:16, it's much easier to put yourself in the shoes of Habakkuk there, anticipating the arrival of the Chaldeans on the horizon. That you can feel that, and there's something to that, to be able to, and that's what, as you said, poetry is so great at doing for us, is to put us in that situation so that, that we can be there with the prophet, feeling what he's feeling, and not just the feeling, of course, but then the faith that ends up trumping whatever the feeling is. This faith that Habakkuk expresses in verse 16, it's simply marvelous. So the text continues. Go ahead.
This is a book where you could hear the hoofbeats of the Chaldeans coming at Jerusalem in chapter 1. You could hear all of this. You can look with horror with Habakkuk over all the stuff that's going on. And then you move down, and then here we get to this wonderful deep breath of a conclusion, these final 4 verses.
Yeah, and the hope really comes through, and the hope comes through even in the midst of all these things happening. So in verse 16, Habakkuk is feeling it within himself. His own body is wasting away. And now in verse 17, it sounds like he's looking upon the land, and he sees a similar thing happening in the land wasting away. So, and you mentioned earlier that Habakkuk 3 really draws on Exodus imagery, and I was going to ask you if it comes up in this section as well, because it certainly is easy to see in the first 15 verses. I think this verse is some Exodus imagery as well. It sounds to me like he's drawing on some of the descriptions of the promised land, and that those things aren't happening now. Go ahead.
Yeah, he's drawing upon heavily the great theologian of the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, where Moses talks about his blessings and curses. And he's describing the curses that are coming, where you talk about Deuteronomy, a book that I'm one of those really wonderful books to work through, and about all of these blessings of the promised land are going away. And he's very upfront here in verse 17.
So take us into some of the imagery that's given here. I mean, let's savor this part of the poetry as well.
Okay, and it involves food, which is even better. So I'm a big fan of verse 17. Is that we move in this, and the movement here, and you talk about how, Hebrew parallelism, each phrase modifies the previous one, is he goes from something that's a pretty nice, a fig tree, a little bit better than fig Newtons perhaps, or the version of figs that I was fed as a child. But the fig tree is a nice image. It gives its fruit in its season. But at the end of the day, if fig trees, heaven forbid, were to become extinct, the world would go on. And even for Habakkuk's hearers, the fig trees are nice. They give you something they give you a luxury item, if you will. But at the end of the day, okay, fig trees failing, okay, we can get over it. But then each one of these he moves into, each one becomes more significant in terms of the loss. So he starts out with a loss that is, at the end of the day, not that big of a deal. It's bad, but it could be a heck of a lot worse. And then we go into the next image. So we go from the figs to the vines. And now suddenly his faith statement becomes really much more profound. When we talk about vine imagery, we're still dealing with part of Israelite agriculture that is not super essential. You can live without vines, but when you talk about wine imagery in the Bible, this is such a massively significant image throughout a good chunk of the Bible. Namely, wine is connected with celebration, feasting, and salvation. If you and I'm in Northeast Indiana, we theoretically have vineyards, but I know my hearers in California will probably be scoffing right now as well. They probably should. You don't wake up some morning to say, I'm going to start a vineyard, so I've been told. Instead, this is the stuff that relies upon peace to even have a vineyard in a special location. Yeah. So now this loss of peace, this loss of the stuff of celebration, which is what wine is always connected with in the Bible. This is not your everyday drink, even in the Old Testament. Instead, it's very much this stuff of celebration.
So, I mean, we talked a little bit about this. Dr. Lessing said Hebrew poetry often uses repetition with intensity. So, I mean, so you're seeing that intensification here. And even, with the fig tree, if the fig tree shouldn't blossom, and then that moves to the fruit. Yep. So not only the fig to the grape and the vineyard, but the blossom to the fruit is happening as well. How about as the poem continues there with the olive, the fields, and so forth?
Yeah. And now it starts getting intense. Okay, fig trees. Okay, that's a fig tree vine. We get that, and now suddenly we go into the life essentials for the last part of this verse. For us, at least for most of us, we probably don't realize the significance of olive trees. I mean, I'm a big fan of olives on my pizza. Don't get me wrong, and yes, I have olive oil in my pantry. But when you're talking this language of the olive crop, and not only is it not yielding its fruit, it's absolutely failed. I mean, it's a much more intense, even verb connected to it. Is that now we're getting into the stuff that daily life depends upon. Olive oil is the stuff that you light your lamps with. It is now life essential, and that nice little peel of kahash there, the intensification of the Hebrew, even if that's completely gone. And then we go, and then it just, even each one of these, it's everyone's a step down as we look at this verse. So olive tree, and then finally we get to fields, sheep, and cattle. And everything that life depends upon, even if all of these are gone. And that climax there, no cattle. So we go from no fields, no sheep, no cattle. And at this point, even if we lose everything, is what Habakkuk is saying. But you'll notice that he takes a lot of words to get there, and that's part of the power here. This is this massive climactic confession of faith here at the tail end of Habakkuk 3. I mean, he could simply say, even if we lost everything, he could say that. And in some ways, the content wouldn't matter. But instead, he slows down and he kind of rattles off. Okay, if we lose a luxury item, if we lose an item of celebration, if we lose all of our essentials. And he draws us into this powerful faith statement now that'll hit us in verse 18.
Well, I mean, so it's been a personal thing for him in verse 16, and now it's becoming a national thing or a community-wide thing here in verse 17. This isn't just going to affect Habakkuk; it's going to affect his whole homeland. And then here comes the faith statement. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Just as as you're talking through the list there in verse 17 and then how it comes, I mean, it reminds me a lot of the way Martin Luther's hymn, A Mighty Fortress, ends, where he talks, take they our life, goods, fame, child, and wife. Maybe that's here we are with the rhyme in English poetry. That's why it's arranged the way it is. but I mean the same idea.
No language is perfect.
That's right. Yeah, the same idea there though. That I mean here's everything that could be taken away from me, and yet they've not won anything. The victory's been won. The kingdom ours remaineth, as Luther's hymn goes. And here Habakkuk says, like, even if all these things are gone, I'll still rejoice in the Lord. I'll take joy in the God of my salvation. How can Habakkuk say such a bold thing there in verse 18?
And you mentioned earlier echoes of the Exodus. Habakkuk is now officially the opposite of the people in the wilderness. I mean, what was their complaint? We're sick of this food. And he's saying, look, even if there's no food whatsoever, I'm going to still trust. He becomes this really almost flipping the imagery of the grumbling people on its head.
Right. I mean, because
then we get
well, it's just say, I mean, not only is he's not just saying like, even though these things are gone, hey, I'm going to survive, but he says, I'm going to actually rejoice in this. That really is the opposite of the wandering Israelites.
Yeah, it's really profound. And this is where I feel like I'm spoiled because I spend all my time in the biblical text. It's just the nature of what God has called me to do. Is I never quite saw that. I've looked at this text over and over again over the years. It's just how different he is during that wilderness generation. They are so upset that they're fed. They just wish they had cucumbers, leeks, and melons. And instead, he's the exact opposite. Even if there's no material reason to follow Yahweh, I'm still going to rejoice. And that's where he and Job have a lot in common. Where those two books really do interact quite a bit.
Tell me more. How do they interact? Tell me a little bit more about that.
So if you think about when I taught Job back, did adjunct professor at Concordia Chicago. I taught Bible, which meant I teach the entire Bible in a semester. And I got to the book of Job, and I said, Job is a book about theodicy. At which point a woman raised her hand and said, I didn't realize Homer wrote it. I said, no, not the Odyssey, the Odyssey. It was profoundly wrong, and just a great line that has now been retold more times than it should, is that the issue in Job isn't so much why does evil happen? And that's not necessarily even the issue here in Habakkuk. It is, what is your motivation for trusting God? Do you trust God because you're a good theologian of glory, or to use the language from a book, The Old Testament is Dying, are you a happyologist? I'm going to follow Yahweh because Yahweh gives me good stuff in the here and now? Or do I trust God because God's God? And that's a very similar thing to what Job and now Habakkuk here are doing, is that he's trusting Yahweh he's trusting Yahweh because he knows that God is the God who saves. It has nothing to do with his present suffering. Because for Habakkuk, just like Job, the present suffering is unavoidable. He's stuck with it.
I think, isn't that the question that the devil asks at the very beginning of Job? Does Job trust God for no reason? Like, does he trust God for nothing? And I think that's a great connection there to the book of Habakkuk, because, will Habakkuk trust God because God gives him a good answer to the answer that he wants to his question at the beginning, or will Habakkuk trust God for nothing simply because he's God? And here, that's the answer that Habakkuk gives. I trust God. I will even rejoice in him, even when there's nothing. And I think, in that way, those things are it's the same question that's being answered and the same beautiful truth that's being given to us as Christians. Yeah,
and it's not too trite to say that Habakkuk becomes a role model for us. In terms of what does it mean to live by faith? It means that you trust even when suffering is what you're going to be experiencing. And that's where 17 just becomes this beautiful image of losing everything, and the connection to the mighty fortress is perfect there, in spite of the fact that it has rhyme, but nothing's perfect. Is that there is this beauty of, okay, we may lose everything, but we're still God's people. God still takes care of us. And then we get into that in verse 18. The English is nice. The Hebrew is even more emphatic. So if you're looking at verse 18, Hebrew does a couple things going on there, and I'm trying to come up with a better way to translate it. Let's see, what did you say the ESV did?
The ESV reads, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation."
Yeah, so probably a better way to even understand that. So what's going on there, for those of you keeping score at home Hebrew-wise, is that we have a redundant personal pronoun there. So Hebrew normally doesn't need to use the word I because the verb can do it. And plus we have Hebrew word order that's actually being moved around here. So probably a better way to actually, even if I were to do the RSV translation, the Ryan Standard Version for that, it would be, but I myself, bold print, in Yahweh, I myself will rejoice. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Yeah, this is in spite of all of this, he has this defiant cry of faith that no matter what will happen to me, I myself will still trust. And the redundancy there in the Hebrew is pretty important. Trying to capture the really strong defiant force is almost difficult in English.
Well, you were saying earlier that the Hebrew poetry is terse. It's short on purpose. So when they use a word that they don't have to use, it's important. And I think that's there certainly in verse 18. The other text that comes to mind with this section of Habakkuk is Philippians chapter 4. And we all know, Philippians 4:4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice, but we don't always make it farther. And we know the part in 4:13 of that same chapter, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. But we forget that part in the middle where Paul has his Habakkuk moment about being content even when he's got nothing and he's been brought low. And the great thing about Habakkuk here is he puts that right up in the front so that you have to go through that before you get to the rejoicing. And I think this is just so applicable to our lives as Christians.
Yeah, and his defiance here, I like how you just brought in Philippians, because you're right. We like this stuff that makes for a good bumper sticker or a T-shirt, and we forget that Paul's whole reason for rejoicing, just like Habakkuk, is the fact that he knows that he's God's child in spite of everything that he may be experiencing in this mortal life. And Philippians is a prison letter, for crying out loud. Things are not going well for Paul when he writes that.
Right. Just like they're not going well for Habakkuk here, or they're about to be going very badly for Habakkuk here, yet he still rejoices. Let's talk about the imagery that's there in verse 19. The ESV reads, God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. What are the images that Habakkuk's using here in verse 19?
Yeah, first he starts out with two divine names for the price of one, which is a big deal here. So your ESV probably has something in small caps. So we go from Yahweh, God's personal covenantal name, the God who establishes relationships with people because God is a God of mercy who saves. So he goes to but he's also Adonai. He's also the master, the one in charge. And then we move from deprivation to absolute freedom and joy. I mean, the language of the feet like the deer. I mean, this is where we can, again, savor, and this is why it's been fun to just be able to not have to rush through 15 verses of tough Hebrew and to be able to slow down here. But this confessional statement, he uses the strongest names for God available, so Yahweh Adonai. And being able to, even though he's going to be walking through the valley of the shadow of death, which is, it's coming. He's already living there, for crying out loud. He's living in that horrible time of everything falling apart, and why hasn't God stopped it yet? And that's how the book started. Is that this idea of, and being able to stride upon the heights, this mountain imagery that also goes with it. When you talk about mountains in the Bible, so we got the high places here, which oftentimes are not so positive. Here they are. But he's able to be at that meeting place where God is, in that language of the heights.
The imagery there again is so very powerful. And again, that I think the word used, defiant, this is a defiant joy that Habakkuk has, that even in the face of all of this evil that's coming, that he's already experiencing, and it seems at the moment that God's not doing anything, yet he has this great joy, the feet like the deer, treading on the high places in a positive sense. I mean, this is just fantastic imagery. We have that note at the very end, to the choir master with stringed instruments, another indication that we're talking here about a psalm, right? This is in a musical context. Dr. Tietz, we've got about 3 minutes on the morning. If you want to comment any on the choir master or the stringed instruments, feel free to do so. But as we wrap things up, I really want to hear from you again on the imagery here, and particularly how all of this Habakkuk uses finally to point us to our hope, the hope that we have in Christ crucified.
Yeah, Habakkuk 3 is a psalm that you and I and our hearers should be praying on a regular basis. Because it really does put our hope and put our perspective where it needs to be. Habakkuk is wrestling with tough times that are coming, and that's what I love about this book. But when he is given his perspective, namely that God is still in charge, and that evil will be ended, and that this suffering won't last, and that the righteous one is the one who walks by faith, knowing that he's God's child, knowing that God's never going to let him go. Because he is that person, he's able to, have his moments of standing in awe, the shaking and the quaking that we saw back in verse 16. And because of that, we as Christians, to use the language of Luther so well, the language of I am baptized, and how defiant of a statement that we have there. Namely, I'm baptized, God's not going to let me go. And I'm more than happy to talk more about that as opposed to the choir master upon the string instruments. Musical terminology, we never quite know what's going on. But it also does encourage us to actually have Habakkuk be part of our own devotions. And I would really invite all of us to use that psalm.
Most certainly, to use the psalm and to recall with Habakkuk that we belong to the Lord. And no matter what may come, even when the answer that the Lord gives is maybe not what we were looking for, that we are in his hands. I love the language from Luther, as you said, I am baptized. That is our reality as Christians. And that's what Habakkuk points us to here in his psalm in Habakkuk chapter 3. Reverend Dr. Ryan Tietz is professor of exegetical theology and dean of students at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, helping us today with Habakkuk 3, verses 16 to 19. Dr. Tietz, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Oh, you're welcome, and thanks again for allowing me to journey with you in Habakkuk.
God be praised. I am your host here on Sharper Iron, Pastor Timothy Appel of Grace Lutheran Church in Smithville, Texas. Next week, we are picking up the book of Zephaniah. If you have any questions about the prophet Zephaniah, send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org or use the open mic feature on the app to send a message. We love to hear from you. Thanks for spending the morning with us. Talk to you again next week.